Greetings, fellow YouTubers. Lindsay here. How you doing? Welcome to my first ever podcast. I'm going to record it simultaneously on the video camera for YouTube, and I'm also going to start it separately here in just a second for the online podcast listeners. I think you'll like this. I'm going to put it in both places. Something else I'm probably going to do is there's going to be, for most podcasts, there's going to be a video version of the podcast where I go and maybe show you something out of the podcast, but I can cover more information in a podcast than I can in a video. So the video will be the same short show you format where I show you things, whereas on a podcast I can give more information and we can go into more detail about a topic. So I haven't actually recorded a video for this yet, but I'm going to, and today's video is going to be about a number of things kind of having to do with the development of the east side of Cincinnati and also some early settlement to Cincinnati. So I think you'll like this one. Let's go ahead and start the podcast. Greetings, everybody. Lindsay here. How you doing? Welcome to the first ever ErvTV Queen City Podcast. In today's podcast, we are going to talk about a big long string of things, but what I want to talk about is the early settlement of Cincinnati. We're going to talk about some kind of downtown but east side stuff and I have learned a thing or two in the research of this podcast, and a lot of you might actually already know this stuff, but I'm very excited actually about today's podcast. So first of all, what I want to talk about, and by the way, I'm referencing Wikipedia on this, so if I get something wrong, let me know. I can always go and change the Wikipedia and edit it, but I find that to be a pretty concise reference for most information because it is publicly publicly reviewed and can be updated and changed. That's the power of it. That's also the weakness of it. Anyway, I've done a lot of reading on these topics anyway, but I just want to throw that out there because Wikipedia is a public, not public, it is a, what's the correct term? I can use it for commercial purposes. And although I'm not making money off this, I feel comfortable referencing Wikipedia. All right, so for those of you that didn't click off when I mentioned Wikipedia's name, I really like Wikipedia. I actually use it quite a bit. It's a great starting resource when you're looking for information about something. All right, so one other article I'm going to reference is a Cincinnati.com article. That is, Cincinnati.com looks like it's part of the USA Today network. It's also associated with the Inquirer, and I will also throw out this article. I will try to put a link with it if I can. Certainly on the video version of the podcast on my YouTube channel, you'll find a link to it, probably on my Facebook page as well. So a lot of people know about the beginnings of Cincinnati, and I am going to have a video coming up here, I think this next week, about flatboats. What is a flatboat? Do you know what a flatboat is? Before I went to Heritage Village for the first time out at Sharon Woods here in Cincinnati, Sharon Woods Park, I didn't know what a flatboat was. The flatboat was the wagon train of the river. It was a small wooden boat that had a small shelter right in the middle. It looked to be about the length of a wagon and was very similar to a wagon in that you could put your stuff in it and you could travel in it, and it was meant to get from point A to point B when moving west, okay? And so flatboats were all wood and they had no motor and you just kind of pushed them. Kind of, sort of like they would have done along the canal back in the day. A big long stick and they would just push along the sides, I guess. That's what it looks like to me. There was no sail on it or anything like that. And so when you got to where you were going, you're going west. Let's say you're going from, I don't know, Pittsburgh, whatever. You're going along the Ohio River. How would you get from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati? I don't know that. But anyway, you go along the river, and when you got to where you were going, you could do two things with your flatboat, all right? You could either sell it to someone else who was going even further west, or in many cases, they dismantled the flatboat and used the wood to build a cabin of some sort, and that was a very good use, repurposing that wood. If you want to see a flatboat, you can go out to Sharon Woods Park. Heritage Village has a recreation of the flatboat sitting right at the beginning of their main street that heads into their recreated downtown area. All right, so flatboats were used to come to Cincinnati when the very first group of settlers, according to Cincinnati.com, and I've heard this before, there were 11 families, which included 24 men, and they came to Cincinnati, which wasn't Cincinnati back then. They came to Cincinnati looking to build a town and to build a settlement. It was a very long time ago. It was in 1788. The United States was a brand new baby nation, and it was the great experiment to see if government by the people could work rather than having kings and queens and all that. So Kentucky had already had a lot of settlers, not quite 100,000 people already were in Kentucky at the point at which our group of people came up the Ohio River and landed across from the Licking River and settled what is now downtown Cincinnati, right there where the baseball stadium is. And what is the story before that point? There was an individual by the name of Benjamin Stites. He was a He was a Revolutionary War veteran. Some of his descendants still live here. I have actually communicated with some of you guys. And he is buried in the old Pioneer Graveyard out on the east side of Cincinnati. He chased Indians into the Cincinnati area in 1786. And story goes that he went, wow, this is really a nice place. And so he went back east, and he said he kind of reported on that. Now, there's another individual by the name of John Cleves Sims, and he was a former New Jersey member of the Continental Congress. And so he bought a bunch of land, most of the land that's now Cincinnati. He bought all this land. And Stites and his group bought some, and another man by the name of Matthias. Am I pronouncing that right? This wouldn't be ErvTV, an ErvTV production, if I didn't mispronounce a name of something, would it? Matthias Denman. We're going to go with that. And Denman is the individual, whereas Sims settled further upriver. Am I saying is it up? Yeah. Stites settled further west, and I'm messing this up. I'm sorry, guys. Let's see. All right, so let's start over. Sims settled further west. I'm getting my directions mixed up. Sims settled further west. Stites settled a little further east, but Denman and his group are the ones we're going to talk about. They settled right in the middle of these three groups. They were the center group, and they settled in what is now downtown Cincinnati. That was that group of 11 families and 24 men that came to make a settlement, and make a settlement they did, friends. So let's kind of bounce around. Another story that really intrigues me about this whole thing was when we came here to settle when the early settlers came here, there was three partners. All right, so we had let me find these names again. I just had them right here in front of me. Hold on just a second here. All right, so we had Stites, who was the owner, and he sold to Denman. And Denman had two partners. One of Denman's partners was named John Filson. Have you ever heard of John Filson? Chances are you may not have. He was born in Chester County, Pennsylvania, around 1747. He went to school in Maryland, and he studied, it looks like he studied with later what would become Princeton. That's interesting. Anyway, that's a little bit of background. He worked as a school teacher, but he was a surveyor in Pennsylvania. And he settled in Lexington, taught school, and he was a surveyor. He came with the group that came to Cincinnati, and he was one of the partners of that came here and put money down to come to Cincinnati. Let's see here. He came with Denman, and he had a 1/3 interest in the 800 acres that would later become Cincinnati. Now, what is tragic about, he's the one that actually named Cincinnati early on that goofy name Losantaville. Now, Losantaville is kind of odd, and somebody went, no, and it was eventually changed to Cincinnati. But he's the one that named it Cincinnati. He left, he never was married. He left no descendants. But let me tell you what's tragic about this is he came to Cincinnati, and while on a surveying expedition near the Great Miami River, he disappeared on October 1st, 1788. Story has it that his party was attacked by the Shawnee Indians. His body was never found, folks. And I find that a little bit creepy. I have looked online to see if, what became of him. He was never heard from again. After his disappearance, his partners, Denman and another individual by the name of Patterson, transferred his interest in the site of Cincinnati to none other than Israel Ludlow. Now, you guys have heard of Israel Ludlow, right? Unfortunately, Ludlow's heirs never reaped any benefit from the subsequent increased value of the land. So I guess Ludlow made money, but after he died, since he didn't actually buy into it, I don't know. I don't know what the story is. According to Wikipedia, they never received any benefit from subsequent increases in land value, anything like that. But Israel Ludlow, now I know you've heard of Israel Ludlow. One of his granddaughters married Salmon P. Chase, so a lot of his descendants were very important in Cincinnati history. There's no portraits of Israel Ludlow, which is kind of odd, but there's a lot of areas that are named after Ludlow, right? So Cincinnati, Dayton, and Hamilton all have Ludlow streets. Ludlow Falls is located near Dayton. There's a couple of streams and a Ludlow Creek. And Ludlow, Kentucky is located just across the river from Cincinnati. Actually is located right across from Mount Echo Park. If you fly a drone from Mount Echo Park, you can look down and you can see the Ludlow Lagoon, the former site of the Ludlow Lagoon. If you could throw a baseball really hard, you could probably make it there from the Mount Echo overlook. Ludlow, Kentucky. Now, Israel Ludlow was originally buried downtown at the Presbyterian Cemetery, and later when they tore it down, they actually built over all the graves. For a long time, his headstone was in the back of a store downtown. Eventually, when they revitalized the area, they dug up all the graves, and he now is buried out in Spring Grove Cemetery. All right, guys, I'm going to take a break real quick for those of you that are watching, that are listening to this podcast online, you can watch it on YouTube, on my YouTube page, my YouTube channel, youtube.com/ErvTV. You'll find Cincinnati history videos there, and every week we do a video where we go out and we see something about Cincinnati history. Sometimes it'll be closed stores, sometimes it'll be abandoned buildings, sometimes it'll just be, something a little less dramatic, but we always get out and we see a little bit of Cincinnati. We learn just a little bit about Cincinnati history. That's youtube.com/ErvTV. Now, what I want to talk about in this next part is once Cincinnati was settled, they had to build homes. Now, the hills were covered with trees. And if you look at early pictures of Cincinnati, even as late as the panorama of 1848, which was a fantastic photo. If you haven't seen it, look it up. It's available all over the place on the internet. I even did a video about it one time on my YouTube channel. In the early 1800s, Mount Ida was what we're going to talk a little bit about in this next segment. Steep Mount Ida. You can see Mount Ida, the hillsides to the east. All the hillsides, they were largely desolate. They didn't have any trees on them because why? Early settlers cut all those trees down to build houses down in the basin where the early settlement started, right where the baseball field is now. And it kind of spread outward from that point. But the panorama of 1848 is absolutely mind-blowing, guys. Go look it up. When you're looking at it, you can see details that just are missing in other photographs, and it goes from I believe the photos themselves that are the long string of photos in the panorama were taken right where the Newport Barracks used to be located. And so from that point right across is right near the Licking River, so you can see straight across to the public landing. You can see all the way that way, you can see all the way that way. And the details, you can see scrap yards, you can see people's houses. On occasion, you can see people standing still, but these photos probably took 30 seconds to a minute to develop. So if anybody moved at all, it's very creepy because there's almost no people in the photograph as a result. But you can see houses, you can see windows, you can see carts sitting still. You can see all the river boats just piled up. You can see details. You can see the dirt. You can see, like I said, there's scrap yards right where they are across from there where they were working on a lot of the river boats. You can see scraps. You can see iron scraps, just riverboat scraps and parts laying around. Very gritty, very dirty, very Cincinnati in the mid-1800s. Why did people, in mid-1800s is when we really saw a resurgence, a surge in population here in Cincinnati, and a lot of that population came from Germany, but other places as well. What were they looking for? Why were there so many people traveling west, coming up the river on flatboats, even in the 1800s, and traveling on wagons? And later, not just first was Kentucky and Ohio, later was Missouri, and points west, Colorado, Utah, the Mormon Trail, and on out west, out to California. And about the time the panorama of 1848 was taken was right before the gold rush of 1849. And all these, what were they still looking for? Well, guys, they were still looking for freedom, which is the story of the history of the United States. Not immigrants from other countries, U.S. citizens. We're still looking for freedom from social justice, social injustice. They were looking for, you go back east, you were in a stratified society, and it wasn't, you didn't have the freedom to move because it was in the mid-1800s, it was pretty much, a lot of the cities back east were pretty well established. And so if you wanted to break out of that stratified society, you went west. There was a lot of religious intolerance. You can talk about the Mormon Trail. A lot of Mormons went west and pioneered that Mormon Trail, which was used by everybody. That a lot of people that went west used the Mormon Trail, and they traveled west for a lot of the same reasons that the United States was originally created, which was they encountered religious intolerance, and they weren't the only ones. There was financial hardships as well. A lot of people had trouble making it back east due to jobs and opportunities, and a lot of people just went west. And so you find that a lot of people came to Cincinnati, but a lot of people came here from other countries, and there was a large German presence that began to make itself known in the mid-1800s. Let's talk about the Longworth family. Have you heard of the Longworth family? The Longworth family was one of Cincinnati's better-known families during the 18 and 1900s. I won't go into the complete genealogy. You guys look it up. The Longworth family it's a pretty interesting story. But according to Wikipedia, Nicholas Longworth was born in Newark, New Jersey on January 16th, 1873. He came to Cincinnati during the first decade of the 1800s, and he was a lawyer. He eventually established himself, and he became quite wealthy, and he purchased a mansion on the east side of what is now downtown, and he purchased all of the, he didn't build it, it was an existing mansion. He purchased it, and along with all the land around it and behind it, all the way up to what was called Mount Ida. We're back to Mount Ida. I mentioned it already once. Mount Ida. That mansion, by the way, is now called the Taft Museum of Art. It's still there. I'm going to go out there one of these days. I never have, but it's on my agenda of places to go. I'll show you that on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/ErvTV. Hey, I'm going to squeeze it in again. Anyway, there's a barren stretch of hillside back then, and the mansion, which was named Rookwood, after the loud rooks, which was their name for blackbirds or crows that were known to live in the trees that were in that area. As a side note, Mount Ida was actually named after, or supposedly named after, a washerwoman by the name of Ida Martin, who supposedly lived in a hollow sycamore tree on the top of Mount Ida. All right, let's get that out of the way. That is just a little tidbit of information. All right, in the 1840s, Nicholas Longworth donated 4 acres on the top of Mount Ida for the purpose of building an observatory. Now, you guys have heard of the Cincinnati Observatory. It's now in one particular spot. It used to be on top of Mount Ida. And I think a lot of people know that. That's not really a secret. The cornerstone was laid on November 9th, 1843, and presiding over the occasion was former U.S. President John Quincy Adams. At 77 years of age, it would be his final public address, and Mount Ida was renamed to Mount Adams to commemorate the occasion. So Nicholas Longworth transformed this property that he bought, possibly including part of the hillside, but I'm not really sure about that, into a very successful vineyard, and he became known as the father of American winemaking, or the American wine industry. He's the one that really started saying, hey, let's plant some grapes and let's make some wines and some champagne, or so-called. And he accidentally double fermented some of his wine and created some bubbly. It became one of the most popular drinks of the time, but he also capitalized on this German influence, this influx of Germans to Cincinnati, and he produced a wine that was very similar to a popular German drink. And so during the late 1840s and throughout the 1850s, this family business absolutely thrived. These guys got rich, not just off of wine, but also off of other investments as well. So the winemaking industry around Cincinnati grew for several decades, and until it was virtually destroyed. This is kind of the sad part of the story. If you are a gardener, you're familiar with some of the diseases that I'm about to talk about that caused the downfall of the vineyard. Downy mildew, powdery mildew, and black rot. This happened around 1860. What else happened around 1860? That's right, the beginning of the United States Civil War. The shortage of manpower needed for vineyard labor and which caused mainly by the outbreak of war, and also the death of Longworth in 1863 helped bring about the end of this golden age of Cincinnati wine production. Now you guys know that Cincinnati during this era, the large German influx and the establishment of what we call over the Rhine was, Cincinnati was synonymous with two things: pork and beer. And alcohol would be a large part of the Cincinnati economy until Prohibition, and even past then. One of these days we're going to do a podcast about Prohibition and about the king of the bootleggers. And what was his name? I can never remember because I have trouble remembering names, but you guys know who I'm talking about. The guy that killed his wife. Everybody knows who he is. And you're going, right now you're saying to yourself, Irv, how could you forget? George Remus, that's his name. Just had to give the old noggin a moment to spin and the wheels to kick in. We'll talk about George Remus in one of these podcasts one of these days. So, Longworth died in 1863. Longworth and his wife Susanna had 5 children, but only one son, Joseph. Now, Joseph's daughter, Maria, founded a famous pottery company. Can you tell me which one? She named it after the family home on Grandin Road, Rookwood. Yeah. So in 1873, the observatory was bought by the University of Cincinnati, and it was transferred from Mount Adams to Mount Lookout to escape all the pollution and all that stuff. There's a lot of smoke because we didn't have electricity yet. Or the idea was just in its infancy, so there's a lot of smoke and a lot of burning of fuels to produce light. And anyway, so the smaller Mitchell building out at the observatory holds the original telescope taken from the Mount Adams Observatory. And in 1873, the building was bought. I'm sorry, in 1873, the building that it's in now was built by Cincinnati architect Samuel Hannaford, which his name is all over the place in Cincinnati. The music hall was designed by him and several, probably dozens of other buildings. Anyway, in 1998, the observatory was declared a National Historic Landmark. Anything else I want to throw at you guys before we close the podcast? Guys, I appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget Road Trip Fridays on ErvTV. We take a road trip to someplace that's within a 2-hour drive of Cincinnati, and we go and we explore. And there's going to be about 7, maybe 8 episodes to this. If it continues to do well, I might do more come summertime, and we'll do some more road trips. Guys, I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you watching. If you're on YouTube, I appreciate it. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep fighting the good fight. And hey, I will see all of you guys in the next video or podcast.